Yeah, thank you very much. Dziękuję bardzo. Дуже дякую. Do you hear me well? Okay, great. Yeah, so I am greetings from Ukrainian Donbass. Today I have visited with volunteers the frontline city of Bakhmut, not far from Kramatorsk. And we brought medicine to hospitals in the vicinity in this area. And during our stay in Bakhmut hospital, the city was hit by Russian missiles 3 or 4 times, actually very close, 200 meters, 300 meters from us. Several civilians were wounded. So you understand me pretty well. I'm overwhelmed with emotions. Usually I'm trying to be an analyst because I missed a lot of the conference because I'm here in the frontline zone. So I would like just to share with you maybe some of my short thesis. First of all, what we hear at the front line, the soldiers are saying that we have a lack of weapons and ammunitions. Everybody knows about that, but when you are closer to the front line, you understand it very, very well, because Russians, they have preponderance in aviation, missiles, and artillery systems. So Ukrainians are bleeding, defending not only our country, but also the values of Europe. And previously, Europe was teaching values to Ukraine. However, what we do right now, we are teaching values to Europe and to the free world. We appreciate all the support which is coming from the international partners, first of all, from the West. However, we are very grateful. However, we should say that this support is belated, it's not enough. We still do not have planes. I believe only now some anti-aircraft, anti-missile defense systems are delivered to Ukraine. So definitely now, until now, we do not have enough anti-missile systems to prevent Ukraine from Russian missiles. Therefore, as I have said, we should use Ukrainians. We shouldn't criticize the West too much for its belatedness, but still we need more, and we urge you, our partners in NATO and in the EU, to do more for Ukraine. Since 2014, when the war started in Ukraine, we were trying to explain to the West that this is not a civil conflict, this is war with Russia. It's very difficult it's impossible to conduct dialogue with the so-called separatists because they are not independent players, they're totally dependent on Russia. Unfortunately, even now, when you see some TV news or you listen to or you read prestigious informational agencies in the West, you may hear and see this word separatists. So 4 months of war is not enough to understand for some of Putin understanders in the West and to some, I would say, qualified journalists who pretend to be very qualified journalists with very famous names, to understand that this is Russian aggression, that Russia is totally responsible for that. No separatists, actually, no separatist armed forces. So we still need to fight these Putin's lies, which sometimes is still bought in the West. Since 2014, we were trying to explain to the West that we have Ukrainian political nation, that we are ready to fight. And in this sense, there are differences definitely between Eastern Ukraine, Western Ukraine, South and the West. But we have political nation, which is based not on ethnicity, not on the language, and not on the confession. it's based on the desire to defend Ukraine. And now you may also see a lot of Russian speakers who are fighting in Ukrainian army saying in the Russian language, we are defending Ukrainian Donbass from Putin. So we were urging the West to do more sanctions against Russia, not to start Nord Stream 2. Nevertheless, it was started. So I would say that if we Ukrainians believe that if there would be sanctions and supply of weapons to Ukraine since 2014, there would be no such a disaster which happened right now. And now the West is talking, yes, Russia is aggressive. We saw the NATO statement that Russia is the main threat in Europe. However, do we hear the words of repentance from Western politicians? Not much. Some are saying, yes, we were wrong. For example, Steinmeier recognized that he was wrong with Nord Stream 2. But not all politicians are saying that. And we should also remember that the words of repentance should come not only from decision makers, but also from some journalists, scholars, analysts who were trying to impose Putin narratives to Ukrainians and also to the international community, unfortunately. I think that Ukrainian society received a very important signal from the European Union when we got a candidate status. We understand that the road to the EU membership would be long and painful because we need to conduct a lot of reforms. However, when we hear right now, well, we should think about what kind of Ukraine would be, how anti-corruption campaign is conducted during the war. All these things are important. And actually, we Ukrainians within Ukraine, we are demanding from our government that we need anti-corruption reforms. We are demanding that we should have new Ukraine after this war. And I personally firmly believe that despite some threats to monopolization of power in Ukraine, there would be no monopolization of power. It's impossible. The civil society received another boost, and the civil society will influence the transformation of Ukraine during and after the war. But right now, we need to understand that it would be not possible to talk about the future of Ukraine if we do not stop Russians right now who are continuing their offensive. We hear from the Western allies that, well, we cannot give you enough weapon because you may use it for the offensive. Guys, how otherwise we would be able to liberate Ukrainian territories which Russia seized even after February 24th if we do not have enough weapons? I think that we should understand that first of all, Ukrainians need to liberate the areas which were occupied by Russia after February 24th, and then decide on the territories of the occupied part of Donbass and the next Crimea. But even to do that, again, we need to perform the task number one: stop present Russian offensive in the Donbass. Therefore, do not tell Ukrainians about the threat of offensive weapons, about necessity not to provoke Russia, not to strike Russian forces, not to respond to some Russian strikes. What we need to do right now is to stop Russians. So we understand Russian nuclear blackmail, but you also need to understand that in order to stop the aggression, it's necessary to be to be strong. You shouldn't again be seduced by the ideas of appeasement of Russia, saving face for Putin, or some painful compromises to Ukrainians. By the way, and finally, I will give you I will mention some of the polls which were conducted by our Democratic Initiatives Foundation, but also by other sociological companies, and all the polls show that Ukrainians do not accept any territorial concessions to Russia, any recognition of the occupied part of Donbass or annexation of Crimea. Ukrainians are not ready to seek peace in exchange for the loss of the territory. I would say that, frankly speaking, this is even strange for me, because we are in the 4 months of the war, and it's very, very painful. And you know, from psychological point of view, when you have such losses, when your towns are hit by Russian missiles throughout the whole Ukraine, and when we have our relatives who are mobilized to Ukrainian army, who are wounded, some of them, a lot of them are killed. So in this situation, the society should become not demoralized, but tired of war, and seem to be ready for some kind of concessions. But so far, Ukrainians do not demonstrate it. They are ready to fight, and now there's this huge sense of unity among Ukrainians. We are working in the one direction of the victory, and I think a very good example was how Ukraine was working for the EU candidate status, because it was joint job by authorities, opposition, civil society, experts, journalists. Definitely we have political struggle in Ukraine, even now, even in the time of war and in the time of martial law. And still we have freedoms. We are democracy, even in this situation. And democracy requires pluralism of opinions, and we have it. Yes, we are trying not to criticize authorities too much. In some cases, we are kind of muted in order not to undermine authorities. But still there is a difference of debates. There is a possibility to criticize the government. And I think it demonstrates that we have democracy. This is huge surprise, huge paradox. But even in times of war, we have democracy. Despite continuous political struggle, despite differences of views between authorities and opposition. And finally, about the future security solution for Ukraine. Is it NATO, or is it non-bloc status with some guarantees? We conducted a poll. It was first in Ukraine during the time of war, face-to-face poll. And that's why it was limited to the western center of Ukraine, where it was possible to conduct not just phone poll, but face-to-face poll. And we put alternative answers to that. Are you in favor of NATO? Are you in favor of non-bloc status, or are you in favor of non-bloc status with some guarantees? We do not fully understand what kind of guarantees and what powers would agree to give real guarantees, not paper type guarantees to us. So what Ukrainians responded to this question? Ukrainians in the western center of the country, 74% chose NATO. 3% chose non-bloc status, and 13% chose non-bloc status with guarantees. So you see that Ukrainians are totally in favor of NATO. Again, there is a criticism of NATO, that NATO appeared weak and belated in response to the Russian aggression. And still Ukrainians understand that NATO provides security umbrella, and Ukrainians are not going to cease to Putin's demands to reject NATO status or to reject aspiration of the NATO status. So we don't know what would happen. We don't know how these diplomatic negotiations would proceed. A lot would depend on the Western position. But the first thing is the situation on the front line. This is the main factor which will influence future diplomatic negotiations and future security status of Ukraine. And I hope that with international support, with new weapons, sanctions, and ammunition, we would be able to stop Russian aggression, finally to liberate us, Ukrainian territory, and find our place both in Europe, but also within the Euro-Atlantic security configuration. Thank you very much. Дуже дякую. Dziękuję bardzo.